Muy buenos días, muchas gracias.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us again. May you all be very welcome. We have a few instructions before we begin. Before we begin the webinar, we would like to tell you that this session is being recorded. All participants will remain muted throughout the entire event. We are going to use the Q&A section to submit questions or comments. And please be respectful of all speakers and participants. Also, we would like to remind you that we have the simultaneous English-Spanish interpretation service throughout the entire webinar. Please click on the globe icon that, as you can see on screen, and select your preferred language, either English or Spanish.
Bueno, tenemos esta agenda.
Okay, so this is today's agenda with the welcome remarks and the brief introduction, and this will be provided by Marcela Jaramillo. She is the executive director of the COP30 pathways, and also some comments from Mr. Jairo Quirós, the Latin America challenges and pathways, and the comments from Leisa Perch of SAEDI Consulting about the Caribbean challenges and pathways, and we will finalize with a section of Q&A. Again, we are welcoming you. My name is Daniela Villalta, and I will be accompanying you today as the moderator of this event. As a brief overview, today's space is designed as an expert dialogue in order to reflect on the key lessons and the challenges of implementation and the strategic priorities from COP30 that took place in November of last year, 2025, in Belém do Pará, in Brazil. This is for climate action in the region for the coming years. This continues to be relevant and has changed in how the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean can strengthen the implementation and the planning for the long term in the coming years. And within this framework, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Marcela Jaramillo. She is the executive director of 2050 Pathways Platform. She has more than 12 years of experience in policy and climate financing, with a lot of long-term planning and strategies towards emissions neutrality. Before taking her new role, she worked in IDB, supporting countries in the design of strategies that are zero net strategies and aligning them to climate goals. Marcela will be opening up the session with her intervention, so we will give her the floor. Marcela, for your speech. Hello, Daniela. Thank you so much for the opening remarks and the introduction and presentation, and good morning to everyone joining us today to the discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. As you have mentioned, Daniela, to begin and to provide context for this discussion, I'm going to give a few words on my reflections regarding some of the outcomes of the COP, which are also important to be mentioned here and put on the table for the discussion that we're going to have in this space. And after that, some elements that we're looking at which could be important and relevant for the region to move forward in advancing with the regional and global objectives of climate action. To start, maybe it's worthwhile to mention, I think that many of you here know a lot about the processes of the COP, but when we are going to reflect about the outcomes or results, I think that we always find a mix of areas of achievements and frustrations. I think that it's a natural outcome within a multilateral process that brings together more than 200 countries to discuss a topic that really needs deep transformations in our societies and national structures of development and economic elements. So without any surprise, I think that COP30 also leaves us with a package of areas where very big achievements have been made and advancements, but also some areas of frustrations were generated where it's important to consider them and to see how we can continue, addressing them to generate solutions. I think, however, that, and before addressing some of those elements that were discussed in COP30 in Brazil, it is very important also to begin by recognizing and celebrating the fact that COP30 took place under geopolitical conditions that were very complex, maybe one of the more complex geopolitical moments during the process in the last few years. However, the fact that it was able to maintain the process and move it forward, more or less in some areas, continues to demonstrate so much value and relevance in this, and also the commitment of many of the countries in continue moving forward jointly in addressing this theme or this topic and in protecting the commitments that are already ongoing from the Paris Agreement. And even if the presence of countries such as the United States, so maybe for me, as a summary, maybe I would think in highlighting a key word that Belém provided, which is implementation. I think that it always was discussed that it was going to be a COP of implementation, and that's going to be an essential element as a focus for the actions of next steps. And maybe whatever is implementation was transformed in the COP, which is a series of pathways or roadmaps. And this is also, there's the balance of how efficient and effective those roadmaps are going to be in supporting that implementation. And that's one of the reflections that I will give. Beyond that, I think that also continues to bring on the table the responsibility and the absolute urgency that the decisions that we're making right now in the short term, both nationally as well as globally, can truly bring us closer to the objective or goal of limiting the increase of the global temperature to 1.5 degrees, and also to strengthen resilience and inclusion in climate resilience, or where we know that everything needs to be, worked on very hard, and that it's important that we need to do it, continue working hard. So I think the 1.5 needs to continue on the table, but it's very fragile. It gives us a very big responsibility of focusing on that effective implementation. And maybe also a little bit before addressing other elements, to think that obviously COP took place in our region, Latin America and the Caribbean. For Latin America and the Caribbean, it was important for the COP to help highlight the unique assets that we have in our region, such as, of course, the topic of nature, social diversity, and also our capacity of innovation. And I think that those elements continue to be essential elements so that in the region we can use this as a compass or a roadmap to achieve the goals. But we do have many real challenges at the regional level. There is no clear collective bet, and there are still gaps and voids that we need to continue working on in order to catapult and to protect this diversity and nature and this capacity of innovation that we have in the region. And maybe to begin addressing some key elements that were covered in the COP, I'm going to mention them to become part of the discussion and to highlight some of the elements that were discussed at the COP. But as we know, the main decision that came out from the COP, it launched several elements in terms of implementation. There is the global implementation accelerated, and the mission of Belém towards 1.5 degrees focused a lot on the implementation. As I mentioned, still there's a lot of questions on how this will be translated in key elements. But what we do know is that the NDCs and the SNAPs continue to be a focus of cooperation, and the NAPs to continue moving forward in cooperation. So this gives us a lot to think of in the region to see how we're going to be translating these new NDCs that have been submitted to the convention, and also where the Latin America and Caribbean region has been very active. It has presented many NDCs. We know that there are some that are missing, and we know that there are many that are in the process of being defined. And we know that there was a lot of very specific work done, very well thought, very deeply thought by the countries of how these can be more practical, how they can advance the implementation, and how we can learn from the lessons that were already collected in the first or the first two waves of NDCs that have been submitted. And it's worthwhile to also highlight, and we had from the platform several very valuable experiences, and I think that they're valuable not only for the region but for the world, where they were presented for this year for the first time, elements of connection of different national elements, particularly the long-term strategies towards 2050 and how those NDCs are a small step in order to achieving those global objectives. We learned a lot and we saw different approaches to achieve that articulation, which is essential so that whatever we're doing right now can truly be adding or contributing to the goals that the countries have provided for their deep transition. And there it's important to remember that at the global level, the NDCs jointly are a reduction of approximately 12% with respect to the levels of 2019. And that's very far away from the reductions that we need, which are 60% in order to achieve the target of 1.5. And I think that here, that's where there's this sentiment, a global sentiment on focusing on implementing more of the targets or goals that have been included in those NDCs that are limiting. And in that sense, one first reflection for us in the region is to think a little bit effectively on how we're going to focus on areas that can catapult and extend the capacity of transforming our sectors and to advance with the goals and targets that have been determined. And so in the discussion that took place in the COP, a very big emphasis on thinking how to move from NDCs to investment plans. And for Latin America, this is not new. In the region, there have been a lot of work in investment plans and financing strategies. And here, what I think is important is to review those lessons learned, what worked, what did not work, and how we're going to embark into a process that might need changes of approaches and that we may not fall again into the same cycle of doing new analyses that maybe are not pushing forward or catapulting the results that we need at the financial, economic, and political levels. And that focus on that institutionality, which continues to be an essential part, and that institutional capacity for the implementation. And it's an area that I believe is really worthwhile to have a regional discussion because there are very valuable experiences in this, and it's worthwhile to capture them and reflect on them to see how we can do it better. What are we short on? What did not work? What did work? And of course, this will have connection with other points that I will mention next in international financing. From COP30, I think it's important to highlight the topic of adaptation, which was this was supposedly an adaptation COP. And here there was also a mix of achieved goals and frustrations. In general, there were some indicators adopted, and there was a little bit of advancement or some progress made in those goals of adaptation. And one of the most welcomed topics was the financing of adaptation for 2035. So there is progress here, but we still need a lot of technical robustness. And I think that it's an area where many countries of the region are moving forward, advancing, but we still know that we still need clarity on how to move it, how to finance it. And in the global context, it's to triple what that baseline. There's still several questions going on. And I would like to highlight as well two things that were put on the table in the COP, which are absolutely essential when we talk about climate change. And it was the topic of the fossil fuels, which was in the discussion. And finally, it was not part of the final decision, but there was work launched around the development of a roadmap for the elimination of fossil fuels, led a lot by the region, Colombia, Brazil, and now also Holland or the Netherlands being part of advancing this agenda. It is a topic that is very important to be addressed in the region. There are many producing countries, and there were many countries that were part of a coalition for this language to move forward in the COP. And although it wasn't achieved as part of the official negotiation process, there's still a window. I think it's an important window where we need to help, to ask this roadmap how it can help the countries to address very real questions and very hard countries. What does this mean for a producing country or for a country where the economy has connections at the energy or economic level with fossil fuels? How are we going to propose, roadmaps and pathways that can actually build on the work that the countries have already done? In many cases, for example, the long-term strategies and NDCs can provide signals and an essential base to continue moving forward with this. And also, there was a discussion on deforestation, which was a little bit diluted, but it continues to be an important window to stop and revert deforestation, which for our region is an essential element as well. So just to mention a few other elements that were advanced in the COP, of course, there's the funding topic. It's a topic that is always very complex and for which there were a lot of expectations in COP30. However, I think that the signals were mixed with regards to the progress. There were some more technical progress and transparency progress, but I think that the financing packaging was a little bit short or small for the countries, especially if we're talking about implementation and of addressing topics that are broader or larger with the global financial structure. There were also very important topics to be highlighted. I think that there was progress done in the Just Transition. Also, the Just Transition program was launched, which I believe is going to be important to put in the focus of the conversation elements of human rights, decent work, social equity. And I think that without these elements, I think the countries and our societies would not be able to move forward with the implementation of transformations in the economy to achieve sustainable development, progress, and climate change. And maybe it's important to highlight that in COP30, there was a very active space of civil society, a space that might have been lost in previous COPs. And I think that also puts on the table the importance and the space given to our region by the active participation of civil society. And I think it's worthwhile for us to highlight that and feel very proud about that. That's just a little bit. I know that there are many other elements that were discussed in the COP, many other activities that could be mentioned, but I just wanted to highlight a few to bring them and put them on the table. And right now, a little bit just to close my intervention, I would like to highlight some elements that really came up in the conversations of the COP with many countries, governments, and organizations, thinking a little bit on what is necessary so that we can truly move from plans, because in Latin America we have many plans which are very robust, many continue advancing, moving forward, but how can we make those plans truly move into implementation, and what could be our roles? So just to give you some reflections on this, what we hear first is to move from reality, not moving from scratch or zero. We need to continue building on the national existing coordination mechanisms and to have an approach of strengthening, not so much creating new parallel institutions, but to strengthen the institutions that are already ongoing, to work through the national systems, not away from them. And I think that this was a very strong, clear message that was also launched with respect to international funding and what that international cooperation should be, to be channeled more through national institutions and regional institutions, and not just through international institutions. Also, to back up a lot the strategies led by countries in finding a mutual responsibility. So the work and implementation to go back and look back to see what exists in the long-term strategies, the NAPs, the NDCs, and to truly do some capacity building and tools and institutions and processes to comply or achieve those elements. And in general, there's still a topic of how to reduce the fragmentation. In reality, when we talk about implementation, it becomes more complex because when we are implementing, we need multiple levels of action with many different stakeholders. So we want that to happen, but at the same time, how can we ensure that those parts can add to something global, and at the same time for cooperation or international financing to not fragment, but to help that to become a total sum, so the goals and targets that are being proposed. I think that from this gives us a very important element, and it's a message, a clear message that real progress depends on empowering the countries so that they can draw their own trajectories and to transform those trajectories in institutional transformations of policies and of investments. And within that, I think it is very important to remember that every country context is very specific. There are no clear molds or recipes of how the implementation will happen, and that diversity in the pathways or trajectories is a strength that we need to celebrate, but it also means a challenge in how we address them and how we can have some support that can facilitate the taking action. And just to simply close, I think that Belém gave us a very important call to truly focus on the implementation, and this is coming with very complex questions related to justice, economy, adaptation, funding, and therefore we have a lot work ahead of us, still with a very complex geopolitical context that for the region is also marked by multiple electoral processes and political changes this year, and where the economic priorities and financial priorities to have a main position in decision making. And it really needs us to reimagine and to redesign elements of the financial architecture and cooperation, governance, and policies to continue moving forward jointly. So national objectives and socioeconomic, but also climate objectives or goals that we have in mind. And this will really depend on our capacity of achieving and protecting those global common objectives and to continue having a dynamic cooperation so that the international collaboration cannot be just stuck in the back. So I firmly believe that we have all the tools, particularly in Latin America. A lot of progress has been done with the work. I think that are essential elements so that we can continue moving forward. And as we advance, we have more difficult questions to solve, but that's a sign that we are making progress in the right direction where we need to move forward to. And that even though there are frustrated elements and our targets and goals are still a little bit far away, we know that the global warming trajectory has come down from 4.4 degrees to 3.2 from many of the efforts done from the Paris Agreement. So it is possible. And I think that we can continue working, and it will require more of a joint support together. So I'm going to stop there, but I also have the curiosity of hearing other reflections and to be part of the discussion. Thank you so much, Marcela, for these clear reflections. And also, from these ideas, we're going to move on to a discussion with the other panelists, the regional perspectives. And we first have Jairo. I would like to introduce Jairo Quirós. He is an expert of climate change experience in Latin America, Caribbean, Asia, and Africa. And he has a degree from Manchester and a professor in Imperial College London. And he currently is also working as a project manager in Climate Lead Group. We would like him to ask him the first question on what is the main message that you see or that you bring from COP30. Thank you very much, Daniela, for your introduction. And also, thank you so much, Marcela, for that very descriptive conclusion of the COP. And how hard to give my opinion now after Marcela. That also makes things more complicated. But I'm going to do some reflections, and maybe in the background, I can focus on the energy and transport sectors, but I will not forget the other sectors that continue to be relevant, as Marcela mentioned. I think that the COP gives us a very clear message for the dear region, that we're not a region with lack of commitments. I think that we are a region with implementation challenges. Today, climate action, as Marcela mentioned, does not depend on new targets and goals. I believe that the new targets have been established in many countries, but there's a capacity or a lack of capacity of execution, and that is due to some obstacles, structural obstacles, such as lack of financing, among others. And I think that's where we can see other bottlenecks in the energy sector. For example, the enabling infrastructure has lots of voids. There's a lack of electric networks or grids. Just a study highlighted that. It was recently published, and interinstitutional coordination should be strengthened. But I would like to highlight from now, like I said, my participation and focus will be more focused on the energy sector, but in the COP and also today, a large part of the discussion is focused on energy and transportation due to obvious reasons, right? The percentage of contribution to the emissions is notable, but in Latin America, we cannot lose sight or forget other sectors and dimensions which are equally critical: agriculture, forests, and land use. These are sectors that need to be treated with the same relevance, not only for the role of mitigation, but also because they are fundamental for food security and for the adaptation to climate change and for the resilience, the territories, carbon sequestration, and ecosystemic systems like health, water, soils, and biodiversity, as Marcela mentioned as well. In the region, we are a region that is highly exposed to extreme weather events, and Lisa will probably be able to tell us more about these events in her presentation, because in the Caribbean, as we know, is very, it is affected every year after year and every time more severely, and therefore climate action cannot be only mitigation and adaptation. And that's why in Latin America, climate action is not only an energy transition, but it's a territorial transformation that strengthens the resilience, development, and also the well-being of everyone, of every person. Thank you so much, Jairo. I'm going to ask the second question. Beyond funding, what structural challenges continue to limit the countries of Latin America of converting these climate commitments and global commitments in true progress in the carbonization, mainly in the energy sector and in the modernization of transportation? And if you could recommend an immediate action for the governments of the region after the COP, what would that be to accelerate these changes in those sectors? Okay, thank you, Daniela, for your question. Let me break down the question in small pieces so I can respond to it. So first, I'm going to repeat that I think that the highlight element of the COP is the change from action to implementation, or from planning to implementation. And it was also mentioned, and also speaking of energy, although there were very limited consensus, and in some media, they even talk about greater consensus, I think that now this fostered a process for a roadmap for the inclusion of climate focus, for a just and equitable focus. I think that for our region, this is a very important sign because it wants to align expectations of public policy and investment. However, here the cross-cutting topic is that the transition stops being an abstract scenario and it moves on to be a trajectory. At least the roadmap wants this to be a trajectory that needs to be executed. I think that in transportation, the COP marks an inflection point in visibility and positioning. The sector has gained a very important position. The first one with the Pavilion of Transportation. There were specific dialogues, discussions, and there was also the fostering of voluntary initiative like the transportation stoptake. This doesn't solve automatically the problems or the issues that are structural in our region. I think that whoever has had the opportunity of traveling throughout our region have lived through the, street or transportation chaos that we have in our cities. And there is no city that is protected from that. I think that there is a very structural issue that needs to be solved. But the COP does allow to change the status of the transportation sector, and it introduces it in the climate agenda of the different countries with initiatives even fostered by the same region, as was done by the government of Chile, with targets or fostering targets for the electrification of the fleet, the regional fleet. So a key message from the COP is the convergence between energy and transportation. To electrify buses, fleet, the logistics is not only a mobility policy, it means new demands for the electric sector and new charging and this needs to be done comprehensively. Whatever we do in transportation, whether to electrify the fleets or to change the way that we mobilize, has a direct impact on this electrical sector. Mode changing, telework, a lot of people are working from home. All those loads and charges change, and that changes, and that needs to be considered in the public policies. And that's why the transformation of transportation depends directly on having a trustworthy, flexible, reliable electric system, very well planned and robust. This emphasis and implementation that I have been mentioning applies with a lot of force, or very strongly for the sector, or it also applies very strongly for the agricultural, forest and land use sectors. Just to touch upon a little bit of the elements of the non-energy sector for the region, this sector is not marginal. It's a key sector for food security, as was mentioned before, and it also allows us to protect the livelihoods, the rural livelihoods, and it also provides ecosystem services like water regulation, the protection of soils and biodiversity, which provide at the same time very extremely important elements for the resilience of the region. It's also one of the main carbon sequestration pots. So honestly, without an attack of the sector of the forest, as a carbon sink, these targets would be impossible to do. So even though we can do the entire decarbonization of the energy sector if we don't address the needs of the forest sector, is going to be extremely complicated. And that's why here we need to look at the decarbonization of the economy as a comprehensive element. It cannot be decoupled between different sectors or disattached. Now, one of the questions is why these decisions and global signals are not completely translated in a complete action. I think that there are several structure challenges that I would like to highlight. First, the enabling infrastructure. Without modern transmission, without modern electric systems and robust, there is no electricity transition. The grids are the ones that help to integrate renewables to sustain rural development and urban development of the countries. We can see energy that is used, which is produced from wind power and solar power, which is not used because of the lack of electricity grids. And also, secondly, because of lack of plans. So many countries have very good plans, but they lack in the implementation of those plans for different reasons. A planning that is decoupled from the regulation, or if it doesn't have any financial feasibility. And therefore, there is a very important articulation between regulation, environmental authorities, financing, etc., for the plans to be executed in the future. Third, the permits and timing of execution of different projects in the energy sector, mainly. And to focus it mainly, maybe I can do an analogy with the transmission lines, as I mentioned before, which are fundamental to connect those new centers of demand with a lower cost generation, renewable, to build a transmission line. So today that can take more than 7 years, and in some countries of our region, even 10 years, which is incompatible with the 2030 horizon, period. That's it. We cannot continue with those delays or those lags, which are incongruent. They are misaligned with the planning of a horizon towards 2030. And fourth, in transportation, there is a gap between intention and execution. Even if the sector gained visibility, many NDCs do not have clear budgets, nor bankable, funds, especially in public transportation. So it's a very big element that we can use to achieve a reduction in emissions of the transportation sector. But more importantly, to achieve a better quality of life for everyone, because today, without a public transportation, the time that we waste in the chaos on the streets in our cities are huge. They're enormous. We are wasting quality of life. The potential of social and economic benefits in public transportation are very hard to quantify, really, but it's abysmal. It's huge. So in short, I think that the COP gave us a greater clarity on what it is that we need to do In the region, the challenge continues to be the how, networks, permissions, interinstitutional coordination, etc. Thank you. Thank you, Jairo, for those reflections about what actions are relevant to implement to achieve transition. Now, I would like to introduce our next panelist. She's Ms. Leisa Perch. She is the Executive Director and founder of SAEDI Consulting. Lisa has more than 20 years of experience in international development, including the work in United Nations, and her work has been focused on climate change, inclusive green growth, gender equity, and sustainable development with a strong focus on SIDS, or small island states, developing states in the Caribbean. She is joining us also as an expert from the Caribbean, from Barbados, and we would like to give her a warm welcome. Lisa, asking her this question. So from your experience, what are the outcomes of COP30 which have had a more immediate impact in the countries of the Caribbean, and what challenges continue to stop global decisions to be translated in concrete actions for small island developing states which are highly vulnerable? Lisa?
Thank you, Daniela, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a sincere pleasure to be here on behalf of SAEDI Consulting and to be part of this very important and timely discussion. The questions that Daniela posed are, of course, very important, but are complex ones. And I'll start off by noting that for us, as we looked at COP30, we definitely had some of the same reflections as the other panelists. For us, what we saw as key outcomes included the resilience frameworks that were launched and the push and nudge that was given to the Loss and Damage Fund. We saw that Caribbean-focused resilience reports were introduced to guide governments on adaptation planning, disaster risk reduction, and climate resilient infrastructure, and the fact that these needed to be blended together, leveraging some of the same points that Jairo would have just made. These reports and these new reports are now tailored for small island states, and they should better help and guide adaptation planning and how that links with disaster risk reduction, and to bring the UNFCCC frameworks with the Sendai frameworks and the DRR frameworks that exist much more closely together. This is a key point for us, given our exposure and our vulnerability to various climate effects, particularly as the region is still recovering, and Jamaica is particularly, as well as Haiti and parts of Cuba, are still recovering from Hurricane Melissa in October. Additionally, the efforts that were made and the discussions towards advancing implementation are also important, particularly at the point at which they leverage simplified climate finance access. So what COP30 would have done was be to emphasize the streamlining of access for SIDS. This has been a big issue for us over a long period of time. If you look at any of the current metrics that exist on climate finance, you will realize that SIDS receive a very small proportion of existing climate finance, about 0.2%. And this is based on information available and assessed between 2021 and 2022. The average annual international public adaptation finance received is done so by 39 SIDS. We've actually got more, I believe, in terms of number, and that's about 2 billion. The estimated adaptation finance that SIDS collectively need is actually about 12 billion. So you already start to see the dynamic there in terms of what is needed versus what is actually available, and the complexities of the requirements, the bureaucracy, the demands, and the impact felt on capacity is not small. Critically for us as Caribbean SIDS as well, in terms of this simplification approach and emphasis, is the fact that a lot of our adaptation finance is delivered as debt. Current estimates suggest that this is 44% of debt. And what I will do is just quickly show this slide so that you can see some of the factors that we really have to consider and think through in terms of thinking about how we are going to leverage what came out of COP30. I hope you can see this. but this is the panorama of different elements that we have to think through, we have to manage, we have to navigate. And while COP30 would definitely have delivered advances, there's still some, as Jairo said, structural challenges that exist. One of those is this, ratio between debt and actual freer finance that allows us to invest in adaptation and to be able to then implement some of the global commitments and agreements and guidance that's also now available on adaptation, also coming out of COP30. One of the things that's important to note is that adaptation finance is currently concentrated in about 10 SIDS, and that's 10 out of the 39 that we would have mentioned. So part of the challenge in simplifying will be to get the other 29 SIDS to be more represented in that finance, to make it easier for them to access resources and at the scale that will be needed. Last quick point on this particular issue is the fact that annual financing gaps that are faced by women-owned SMEs in emerging markets are also quite significant. And we're talking about $1 trillion in a gap that really needs to be addressed if we're going to address vulnerability, resilience, livelihoods. We're also going to empower people to be able to adapt as well. And so those are some of the key elements that we are thinking through, certainly from SAEDI Consulting, but some part of the debates that we have ongoing right now in terms of how we look at COP30. Other things that have come through is the fact that we're talking about a 1.3 trillion annual climate change pledge with opportunities to scale renewable energy resilience projects, as I would have mentioned. I mentioned the fact that the loss and damage fund was operationalized with clear pathways for Caribbean states to access finance for climate impacts, which is important because that also deals with the disaster risk reduction side, while most of the funding from the GCF and the GEF would be about adaptation and not necessarily response. The commitments to capacity building are also welcome in terms of training and technical assistance, particularly those that would strengthen institutions to implement climate smart policies. The voluntary fossil fuel transition mentioned by Jairo as well as Marcela. And then for us, critically, in terms of the work that we do, is the advance that was made on the Belém Gender Action Plan that was adopted that directly impacts and shapes not just the Caribbean and SIDS in general, but the world's efforts to make sure that we're embedding gender equity and equality into climate action frameworks. What is also important about the Belém Gender Action Plan is that it takes us from 2026 to 2034. And so it's a pathway and a map and a roadmap that takes us forward at least for the next 8 years, which will be important for a lot of the work that we're doing now and in the future. In terms of structural challenges, I've mentioned some, but I also want to emphasize some that I think need to be brought forward a little bit more. Data and knowledge gaps remain a critical issue. We often have incomplete and outdated climate data. We often don't have climate data that works well or is very well combined with social and economic data. We also don't have data that speaks to socio-environmental impacts, socioeconomic impacts, eco-environmental impacts. And some things, part of the big gap is the fact that we miss the nexus pieces. The human resource shortages have been mentioned, but also the ability to scale. Do we have enough capacity and the frameworks to scale how we respond to vulnerability? I think if you ask most SIDS, that remains one of our perpetual challenges. We are also still dependent on external expertise, and that is external within countries and also within the region and the regions in which we work. We're doing better at being able to pool expertise regionally and even globally when it comes to state-specific requirements, but still it's a challenge. And you can imagine that some of those challenges also mean time differences, these shortages and challenges that come with limited financial resources. Last but not least is the fact that political and social constraints generally, and I know that we want to be careful in terms of how we talk about the geopolitical realities, but they are there. And they also shape an environment that is not always enabling right now to either climate change in general or to responding to the social adaptation requirements that are needed if we're really going to sustainably respond, adapt, and be resilient to climate change. And COP30 really exposed the gap between the ambitious climate finance pledges that we usually have at COPs and beyond, and the fact that we are still dealing with relatively slow, fragmented delivery, particularly at the multilateral level. So I'll stop there in response to your question, and I look forward to the next ones.
Muchas gracias, Lisa,
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your reflections. Another question for you is, what type of regional partnerships do you believe are more strategic to strengthen the influence of the Caribbean in the climate negotiations, global climate negotiations?
That's a great question. I think that in the Caribbean region, we have done we have made an enormous effort to really coalesce and to coordinate within our region with support from CARICOM, but also with support from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which we recognized was necessary about 20 years ago. The center celebrated its 20th anniversary, I believe, last year. And that is testament, I think, to the recognition and the early recognition and the commitment that the region has put together. We've also been longstanding members, supporters, and even leaders of the AOSIS effort. And AOSIS is the Alliance of Small and Developing States globally. And that coalition continues to be important to us. We're also members of the G77. We're also members of other groups. I think a key, we also have GRULAC. I think a key element of this, for me at least, is to look at how we enhance our collaboration with the Latin American countries, as we're doing in this webinar. We need to really make sure that our common and shared interests are the things that guide us. Yes, we have language differences, so we speak about 4 or 5 languages. We've got English, we've got Dutch, we've got Spanish, we've got Portuguese, but that should not be a barrier to us. We've got interpretation capacities. We've got people in the region like myself that actually speak 3 or 4 languages. We need to leverage this much, much more than we're doing. We talk about our small size, but if we combined with Latin America, we would no longer be small. Some of the largest countries in the world, some of the countries with the largest capacities for carbon sinks, et cetera, are in the LAC region. And so I think for me, that's one of the things we need to work on. SAEDI Consulting lives and breathes this because our team is global. We may be based in Barbados, but we have a colleague based in Costa Rica. That's how we made this collaboration with the Climate Lead Group. You start small and you build and you continue to build. We have colleagues in Ethiopia. We have colleagues in Nigeria. I think also part for us is going to be working very closely with the LDC group. Now, normally we tell ourselves and we say, well, we only have one LDC in the region, Haiti, but we also need to remember that Haiti started before us when it came to issues of independence and building frameworks and systems. There are lessons to be learned from the Haiti scenario. And the fact remains is that we may not want to admit this, but any of us could be Haiti at any moment if things fall apart badly enough. We need to collaborate. We need to integrate Haiti's realities and resilience as well, because they continue to persist despite very significant challenges. So we need to also learn from that. But I think also we need to work, and we are doing the work to work more closely with the Africa region. We have a Frexim Bank in Barbados in the region now working on issues of trade. And if we are going to be addressing some of the issues that are flagged by Marcela and Jairo when it comes to access to systems, access to knowledge, access to capacity, we acknowledge that we will never have all of the capacity. We have a diaspora out there, but we also have partners in other parts of the world, people who are innovating at scale and capacity that we need and that we may never have, that we can leverage for our own responses. So I think part of it is really going to be doing the research to find out who's doing what, having the open communication, having the collaborations, building the networks, building the partnerships, and leveraging finance in innovative ways, not just the public versus private and even the blended, but also leveraging the scale of finance needed. If we alone as 15 can't do it, can we join with other bigger countries who can attract that finance? I think those are some of the things that we have to be very realistically looking at right now, particularly given our environment. Sophia, I apologize because I think I was a little passionate there and possibly a little fast.
Thank you for your consideration.
Muchísimas gracias, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that passionate reflection. We are going to move on to the last section of our webinar for today, which is the section of Q&A, questions and answers. In the chat box, we have a question for Marcela, given by Natalia Victor. The question is the following: how can the multilateral banks, or MDBs, and other financial institutions, international financial institutions, accelerate the implementation in the region? So that's for you, Lisa. No, Marcela. Thank you, Daniela, and thank you for the question. I think that these are absolutely important stakeholders. I began. Okay, now you can hear me. Sorry. Sorry.
Me voy a pasar a español. Me había cambiado de canal. Que gracias, Daniela, por la pregunta.
Thank you, Daniela, for the question. I was saying, and also to the person that shared the question, because I think that multilateral banks and others play a very important role in the region. I think that there is real challenges, but there are very important elements. First, I think that relationship country-bank is very important. And here I think it is essential how the country programs of the countries and the development banks are really or truly integrating the priorities for climate transition. I think that SIDS are not there. Many of the resources are going to be more programmatic and more reduced than they should be. And I think that that's an essential element, and where I think it is very important for the countries to have the support and the capacity of putting on the table what they need within those country plans, which are the central axis for cooperation with the development banking systems. And especially I think that with the geopolitical environment right now, where there's true pressures in matters of climate change at the international level and cooperation level, that country demand is the essential one, because more global initiatives right now, I believe, are more in a vulnerable spot where there's global initiatives that are for supporting specific themes. I think that right now we need to be strategic to understand the current context and to address it from where we believe that there is, from where there is the capacity for those resources to be contributing to the country agenda. And there's another very important point, and also for us, I believe it's something that we've always tried to work on, but we need to improve, that climate agenda really integrated with the development goals of the countries, of how the progress in the mitigation and adaptation and resilience contribute fundamentally to the social, economic prosperity and development goals. And I think it strengthens the capacity of raising those funds, and I think it's going to be an essential element in the region, with several countries going through elections, are going to have those new relationships with the banks that are made with new governments that are coming on the table, and to truly bring in these essential elements for the countries to continue moving forward with their development goals and climate change goals. And I think that at the international level, we all play a responsibility of continue pushing forward and protecting and generating the discussion spaces beyond the COP and other spaces, G20 and other elements, so that we can continue moving forward with the need of a global reform. And I think that also Leisa was mentioning very South-South work. There is going to be other elements of cooperation that are very important for those banks to later respond to. So that's my reflection now, but truly very important stakeholders or actors.
Muchísimas gracias, Marcela.
Thank you very much, Marcela. We have a question for Jairo that says the following: in Latin America, what collaborations between countries and institutions or sectors are considered more strategic to accelerate the energy transition and mobility, sustainable mobility? How could these partnerships strengthen the influence of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean in these topics at the global level? Thank you, Dani. And thanks to the person that asked the question. How hard to think on what are those collaborations, because I think that throughout the region, there are similarities and differences that are very marked, and Lisa mentioned it. But in the energy sector, no doubt, the region could be split or broken down in Central America, which has an energy system that is pretty integrated. We talk about the CIPAC, where there is energy exchanges that are very well known. And then we can go towards the Andean region, the Southern Cone region, and the energy changes between Brazil and other neighboring countries. I think the exchanges of knowledge beyond energy flows are very important for this region. I think that there's specific knowledge that we can tap into throughout the region. I'm going to give the case of Chile with the electric buses. No doubt, one of the examples that need to be followed throughout the region, especially Chile has the bus fleet, or the biggest electrified bus fleet in the world, right after China, obviously, which marks a very important transformative element in the sector. One of the sectors that has the largest, emissions emitted in the region as a single sector. So Chile has a lot to contribute to the region, I believe. And with the exchange, I've known a lot of exchanges that have happened between the Dominican Republic and Chile, as well as Costa Rica and Chile, among others. I'm going to stop there so that I don't take up too much time. Thank you very much, Jairo. We also have a question in the chat box for Lisa, and it's asked by Angelica Madrigal, and it says, what would be an immediate action that you would recommend for the Caribbean governments after COP30? What opportunities are identified for the region so that the region can be more strengthened and better positioned to COP31 and COP32?
Thank you, Angelica, for the question. That's a tough one to think about but I think if I was going to suggest something, it would be leveraging some of the discussions we have had this morning. I think focusing on transport and infrastructure is a fundamental issue for the region in terms of mobility on a number of levels. We have countries that are single islands, and we have countries that are multiple islands, and we have countries that are 700 islands like the Bahamas. And if we could figure out and address issues of transport and mobility as well as infrastructure, which kind of drives also or the engines of our economies, I think that would make a fundamental difference to our overall adaptation strategy and how we also link that in to mitigation as well as unlink mitigation and adaptation. I think a critical thing for us is the fact that to us, adaptation is mitigation and mitigation is adaptation. And I think we need to speak more strongly towards that reality. We're too small to be separating those two things. We are not talking about energy resilience just because we need to reduce CO2 emissions. We do want to do that, but we don't contribute enough to make that really a priority. We do that because it helps us to adapt in stronger, more fundamental ways in our economies. It makes us less vulnerable. It makes us more resilient on very structural areas. So I think improving our communication, our advocacy, our planning, our strategies around that would be key. Next piece for me is making sure that that has a human face. Don't mean to critique negotiators are excellent and above par at all levels, but I think we need to be stronger on making the social human case on this element. We need to be leveraging the frameworks that exist that help us to bring gender equality, not just for women, but to bring it in for vulnerable people, for our persons with disabilities, for our elderly, for our children, for our homeless, for persons who are the working poor. All of those persons we're expecting to participate in climate change adaptation and in the efforts for which we're bringing funding in, but often they don't even have the power or the time to do that. And so if we're not thinking about how they're going to bring them in their efforts, we're going to bring in their time, we're going to bring in their innovation, we're not looking at them as people who have solutions necessarily, but often they might. We have no idea. But if we're not asking them, we may also be missing key parts of the solution and things that could make our transition much smoother, much more equal, much more efficient, and even in some cases cheaper. And so for me, those would be the two things that I would suggest we need to think about and to do much better on. I'm not saying that we're not doing it, but I think we need to be doing better. And I think lastly, we need to bring our framework to addressing climate change, not just to respond to the existing geopolitical challenges, but to recognize they are always there, they will always be there at some level. And we need to bring in that political economy into our analysis, our thinking, and our response. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Lisa,
you
por
so
esta
much, Lisa,
respuesta.
for this answer.
Muchas gracias a todas y todos por
Thank
estas
you all
reflexiones tan
so much for
valiosas.
these very valuable
Sin duda
reflections.
nos deja
Today's
mensajes muy
discussion
claros
gives us very
sobre la
clear messages
importancia
on the
de las
importance
planificaciones de
of
largo
planning,
plazo, la
long-term
necesidad
planning,
de
and
fortalecer
the
la
need of
implementación,
strengthening
el
the
valor de una
implementation
mayor
and the value
coordinación
of a
regional
greater regional
para avanzar
articulation
en la acción
to advance and
climática.
move forward in climate
Y
action.
en nombre
And
también de Climate
also,
Group,
on behalf
SAEDI
of the Climate
Consulting,
Lead Group and
quisiéramos
SAEDI Consulting,
agradecerles
we would like to
a
thank you
nuestros
all,
panelistas
our
el día de hoy,
panelists
a Marcela,
today, to
a Jairo y a
Marcela,
Lisa,
Jairo, and
por su
Lisa,
tiempo y
for your
aportes,
time
y a
and
todas las
contributions,
personas
and to
que
everyone
se han
that has
conectado el
joined
día de
us
hoy, que están
today.
atentas
And we're
a
paying
este
close
webinar.
attention to this
Estaremos
webinar.
compartiendo
We will
un breve
be
resumen
sharing
de
a
los
brief
principales
summary
mensajes
and the
del webinar
main
en los
key
próximos
messages of the
días.
webinar in the
Y
coming
les
days.
invitamos
And we
también
also
a que
invite
nos
you
sigan
to
por
follow
nuestras redes
us
sociales
through
y
our
por
social media
nuestras páginas
and
web.
through
Las
our web
vamos a
pages.
colocar en el
We're
chat
gonna
y
include these and
estaremos
share them on the chat
entonces
box,
seguiremos en
and
contacto
we will
y
stay in
muchísimas
touch.
gracias
And
para
thank you
continuar
so much
esta
so that we
conversación.
may
De
continue
esta
this
manera
discussion.
cerramos el
And we
webinar
are
de hoy.
going
Muchísimas
to
gracias
close today's
a
webinar.
todos y
Thank you
todas y
all
les
so much,
deseamos un
and we wish you
excelente resto
all
del
a
día.
great rest of the day.
Muchas gracias a todas y a todos.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Muchas
Thank you so
gracias.
much.
Muito obrigado a todos y todas.